Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Bitcoin, dubious speculation. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. If you use the code 2023 at checkout, you'll actually get another 10% off your first month. So make sure you guys check that out, and you can get that rate. Let's go ahead and jump in. So in these dubious speculation videos, I just want to talk about potential outcomes. I'm not here to tell you what's going to happen because frankly, the likelihood that I draw out what's going to happen is relatively low. But I do want to talk about likely outcomes based on what we've historically seen, nothing more, nothing less, noting that oftentimes we can diverge from the past. For instance, in 2019, we had a drop below the bull market support band, the 20-week SMA, the 21-week EMA, in Q3 of the pre-halving year, just like we did in 2015 and just like we did in 2011. So going into this pre-halving year and really going into Q3, we said, look, we're probably going to have a correction in the stock market, and that correction will likely cause Bitcoin to fall below its bull market support band, right? So that's what we said. And it did. But you can see that it diverged after that because while last cycle, after falling below, we got rejected by the 20-week SMA, this cycle, we got through it on the first attempt. You can see last cycle, it took 2 attempts to get through it. This cycle, it only took 1. So clearly there has been some divergence between what was going on in 2019 and then what was going on in 2023. So we need to be at least aware of that, take inventory of that. And again, a reminder, and I constantly have to remind myself of this and to remind people, is that a DCA strategy for Bitcoin tends to work better over the long run than trying to time the market too much. That doesn't mean that you can't, get lucky and get some pretty good buys in at various parts of the cycle. I just stick to the risk metric. So when the risk metric is low, I DCA. When it's sort of elevated, I stop. And then when it's high, I start to sell. That's all I do. Nothing more, nothing less. So we'll talk about potential outcomes, but I'm not looking at these outcomes to sort of dictate what I'm doing with my own Bitcoin. I want people to be aware of that, because if I don't say that, I think people assume that, if it reaches a certain price and I'm selling, or if it goes down to a certain price that I'm buying. But I just stick to the risk levels. I just want people to be, reminded of that. One thing that often happens when we sort of set these milestones is that we'll eventually retest them. It doesn't always happen. Like sometimes Bitcoin will just kind of trend higher for a long time and not give people that opportunity. But a lot of times you'll see, like, after breaking out to a new level, it'll fall back in eventually, right? And I mean, it's happened before. Like if you go back to 2015, we had a level, and then once we broke through it, we pretty quickly back tested it, and then we had this level, and then once Bitcoin broke through that, it eventually back tested it. If I actually draw it up to the wicks here, right? So you can see that there's this common pattern of breaking out, back testing, breaking out, back testing, and so on and so forth, right? That was a common pattern that we had in 2017, more or less all the way up. I mean, there were some times where it didn't give people the opportunity to get back in, but there were still plenty of times where you would go back test it, and then continue trending higher. Last cycle was similar in some ways, but different in others, in that you had this level here that, over here it was right around where the price was. Here we held it as support, right? But what's interesting is that in all cycles, except for the very first one, there is this 100-week moving average that once you got above it, you eventually retested it, right? So like last cycle, once we got above it, it took about 5 months, and then we eventually retested that 100-week moving average. The cycle before that, it didn't take nearly as long to retest it. It only took about 5 weeks or so. We've actually broken through the 100-week moving average not too long ago, and it's been about 5 weeks so far, right? So it's been about 5 weeks so far, and Bitcoin just slowly keeps going higher, right? And in fact, it actually broke above $38,000 not too long ago. So Bitcoin has continued to sort of slowly grind higher. But that would sort of be I think that would be the area to look for in future pullbacks, is, not only the 100-week SMA, but also the bull market support band. It has been very handy this year It found support there. It found support there. It did not find support here, but we didn't think it was going to, right? We said it's probably going to fall below the 20-week SMA in August or September, and it did. And then it diverged from the 2019 pattern here in October. Okay, now the bull market support band currently ranges from around 29,987, so around 30K, all the way up to about 31K. So, and that's actually moving higher somewhat quickly. I do want to look at this in a few other ways, just very quickly, and we'll go through a few different ways to look at this. Let's go ahead and get off the bull market support band and the moving average. You can look at the retracements and see that like last cycle, Bitcoin rallied up to the 618 in the pre-halving year on a wick. The main level that it reached on like weekly closes was the 0.5, right? So the 0.5 retracement. There were a couple wicks higher, but those were relatively short-lived. That 0.5, just for reference, so that people are aware of what valuation that would correspond to, that 0.5 level, this cycle would correspond to around $42,000, around 42K, which is kind of interesting because, that's about 3 times what this, what we ended up going up to over here. But around 42K. The 618, by the way, is all the way up at around 48K. So you have 42K and then you have 48K, a much higher price level if it were to go up to the 618. While it made it to the 618 in June of 2019, you can see that the cycle before that, it actually took it a lot longer to reach the 618. You can see that it reached the 0.5 by June of the halving year, and it didn't reach the 618 until December of the halving year. So basically another year away in that cycle before it actually retraced to that level. And then last cycle, again, it got there by June of the halving year. This cycle is obviously taking longer than last cycle because, we're already well past June of the pre-halving year. Last cycle was June of the pre-halving year. This cycle, we're clearly past June of the pre-halving year, and it still hasn't hit the 618 or the 0.5. So just some numbers to keep in mind if the rally were to continue, 42K and 48K. Coincidentally, that corresponds somewhat loosely to the logarithmic regression rainbow that we have here. If you remember the 2.5 log line rule that we've historically seen play out, that's half, 1, 2. That one is currently at around 46 to 47K. So that would, I think, be an area of interest if we're able to rally that high. Another way to look at this, though, in terms of pullbacks and the frequency at which they occur, if you go look at the time frame on this, from here to here was about 15 weeks, right? From this low to this low. And then this low to the next low was about 14 weeks. And then from there to the next low was about 13 weeks, right? So you're looking at about 13 to 15 weeks from one low to another. If you look from this low in September and you go about 13 weeks, that would put the next one in the week of December 11th. If you go out 15 weeks, it would put the next low the week of December 25th. So I do want people to be aware that if there is some type of pullback going into the end of the year, then you would probably look towards the prior range highs over here as the level where buyers would probably want to step in and try to defend, right? You also have the bull market support band between 30 to 31K, which is about to cross above sort of this threshold, right? So if there is a pullback, that is, I imagine, the area that the bulls would want to step in and try to defend. If there's not, sometimes Bitcoin just sort of slowly grinds higher and it doesn't give people the option, like it did over here, right? It didn't really get any significant pullback. So, at this point, so far this cycle, it's been a little bit more orderly than what we had in 2020, but that would be the area to in fact look at. And it's always hard to know. It's always hard to know where the sort of the short-term tops end up being before they pull back. You can always come up with reasons why they could occur at any time. Sometimes we'll go above a certain level and just sort of grab liquidity, then we'll go back down and take out the people that got in really late, and then they sell on the downturn, and then we just go right back up. It's a brutal market, right? It really is a brutal market. One thing that I've received a lot of criticism for, and as much as it's painful to read, I do think it's somewhat merited and fair, is that I talk about the downside risk too much. I do have mixed feelings about it. I do think talking about the downside risk is useful. Talking about the upside potential, though, is also useful as well. Um, and, we have talked about that somewhat this year. Like, I gave my high-end target this year of Bitcoin to be 35K, and we took that out, right? So, I talk about the upside risk in the sense of like, okay, we could go as high as 35K, but then if you go above that level, what more is there to say, right? Like, I'm not going to say, oh, wait, no, now it's going to be 36K. Oh, just kidding, 37. Oh, no, 38, right? I'm not going to do that. I gave my high-end target for the year of 35K. We took it out, right? That I was underestimating how much Bitcoin would go up this year. That's clear because we've already gone above 38K. So I just wanted to be aware, let people know I am aware that I do talk about the downside risk a lot, but it's more or less because of my own experiences, right? And seeing the last two cycles, form a double bottom and then a macro higher low, right? So who's to say that something like that can't happen again? It doesn't mean that it will, right? Like, there's no guarantees in markets. We might not get that, right? I mean, maybe you could always go up and then come back down, and do something like we did in the 70s with the stock market. But if there is a pullback into 2024, you would want to look for those macro levels to hold, right? Either a double bottom, it could be a higher low, something like that. If there were some type of major event, I think a lot of times people look to try to figure out what that event's going to be. The truth is that it's impossible to know. I mean, there's always something to worry about. I think the issue is that the things that a lot of people think will be the reason why something could pull back, often it has to be something completely unexpected, right? It has to be something completely unexpected for the market to really care, because otherwise the market will just keep climbing the wall of worry. So if we get a pullback at, around these levels, or if it does poke above 40K, look to see if the prior local highs hold, right, around the bull market support band. And again, the 100-week SMA will slowly start to curl back up as well. So those are some areas I think to look for. And if those fail to hold, right, if those fail to hold like they did over here, then you have to be prepared for a scenario of, it could be a macro higher low, it could be a double bottom, right? It could be all sorts of things. No guarantee it's going to happen, right? But it could happen. And if it does, it's always worthwhile to be prepared for something like that. As far as the altcoin market goes, the altcoin market has had a pretty significant rally here, all the way up, in fact, to the 100-week moving average. I've been pretty critical about alt Bitcoin pairs this year, because my general thought process has been that they'll bleed back to Bitcoin, and they have, right? I mean, they certainly have. Bitcoin dominance has gone up for the entire year, and Bitcoin dominance, in fact, has not had a single weekly close below the bull market support band for the entire year. So alts have been collectively bleeding back to Bitcoin. You should note, though, that at some time in the halving year, that trend will likely change. I imagine that in the halving year, we will get closes below the bull market support band for the Bitcoin dominance. So I do want people to be aware of that there will likely be some durable changes in alt Bitcoin trends in the halving year. So I just want people to be aware of that. In the past, like in 2015 and 2019, I saw most altcoins bleed back to Bitcoin, and I was just DCing altcoins. And then I always look back and I'm like, well, I should have just bought Bitcoin instead. I should have just kept my portfolio Bitcoin heavy. This cycle, I made sure to sort of not make the same mistake. And instead of, getting too much into the altcoin market in the pre-halving year, I've mostly focused on Bitcoin, because I thought the Bitcoin dominance would go higher. And that's the reason why I've kept my portfolio Bitcoin heavy. I want people to be aware that while I do hold that view, even still, and going into the end of the year, I want people to be aware that narrative will likely change in 2024, right? You have to start adjusting your mindset to how these alt Bitcoin valuations could start to change as we get out into the halving year, especially if it's accompanied by a Fed pivot, right? And we go back to looser monetary policy. It doesn't mean you can't have a sell-off before that, right? I mean, oftentimes a Fed pivot would correspond to a sell-off, but on the other side of a Fed pivot, once the market has found whatever low it's going to be, that's when alts would start to durably outperform Bitcoin. So I want people to be aware that I've had this very strong opinion about alt Bitcoin pairs this year, and the dominance has gone higher all year long. So it was the correct view to hold. That view will likely have to change sometime in 2024, and you can always, of course, try to prepare, plan accordingly. Okay. So just going back to Bitcoin USD, we looked at the logarithmic regression rainbow. We looked at the Fibonacci retracement. I also think it might be worthwhile to look at the short-term bubble risk, which is essentially the extension from the 20-week moving average. So if you pull up the 20-week SMA, there it is. We'll go ahead and hide the 100-week. You can see that Bitcoin's extension from the 20-week SMA is actually around where it was previously, right? So like there was, if you go back and look at the initial breakout over here, there were 2 times where the extension from the 20-week moving average came right up to this same level that it just hit today, right? So sort of drawing the line across, that's where it just went to. There was a period where it went slightly above that in March, but for the most part, the extension from the 20-week has kind of been around, where it's been today. So just be aware of that, and that if it does go back down, it's that bull market support band that you would, that the bulls would want to step in and try to hold as support. Because when you get below it, that's of course where danger can slowly start sort of creep in. So do be aware, right? Do be aware of that. That's the short-term bubble risk. You can also visualize that by looking at like the natural log of the price over the 20-week moving average, and just kind of looking at some of the macro trends there. It hasn't, there does tend to be decreased extension from the 20-week moving average as we continue to go on. So like if we do hit that threshold at some point, that would likely be sort of a timely point in Bitcoin's history to do what you want, right? I'm not going to say anything, I don't offer financial advice, but oftentimes when you're hitting that line, it does tend to be a timely area. Note that we didn't really hit it last cycle until the end of the halving year. Cycle before that, we didn't hit it until the end of the post halving year. Cycle before that, it was also in the post halving year as well. So there's no guarantee we're even going to hit it this year. In 2019, we didn't hit it. We actually we got kind of close, and then we just sort of faded back down, and then we went back up a year or two later. So do look at that. Current valuation there is 0.23. To get back up there, it'd be about 0.43. So it'd have to go up quite a bit in order for it to trigger sort of that diminished extension from the 20-week from one cycle to another. So in terms of macro, or in terms of higher low structure, I think I mentioned this earlier, but it's been about 13, 14, 15 weeks or so between all of these higher lows. So if that pattern holds, then it would be sometime in it could be December. If it goes a little bit beyond 15 weeks, it could be sometime in early to mid-January, where you would expect some sort of back test, right? To go back down and see if we can hold the 30 to 31K level as support, right? So I imagine that's going to come sometime, in December or January. It could also not go back down that far. There are instances where Bitcoin doesn't go back down as far as sort of the breakout point, but again, like there's plenty of times where that is the case, right? Where you break out and then you eventually you sort of back test where that breakout point was. This has happened many times in history. It will probably happen many times in the future as well. An interesting thing I was looking at, this is nothing to really say on how high Bitcoin can go, but inflation has been, a big topic this year. And so I thought, hey, maybe it would be useful to look at the valuation of Bitcoin divided by the US inflation rate year over year. And when you do that, what's interesting is you can see that when you divide by the US inflation rate year over year, Bitcoin has actually gone up 500% this year, approximately. Well, since November, right? Maybe not this year, but since November, it's gone up about 500%, which is kind of interesting because, and also, by the way, this level here corresponds to this level right there in October of 2021. And I'll probably do another video more or less on this, but you can see just how different it looks when you account for the inflation rate. What's even more fascinating is we got a similar rally in 2019 when inflation wasn't as much of a topic, right? Like if you look at the Bitcoin divided by inflation over here, it also rallied up basically the same amount. Like, it's kind of crazy. Like, it's like, how can that be possible, right? Like, you know, from this low to where it is here, a 490% rally, and then from this low to there in 2019, a 490% rally. Like, it's crazy how it you know, ends up being the exact same thing. Could we go higher this year? Absolutely, right? Again, my high-end target for this year was 35K. And I've learned the lesson in the past the hard way is when you put out a price target and it goes above that level, it's silly to get in the business of then saying, all right, no, now's the high. Oh, no, just kidding, now, right? It's just say, hey guys, my target was 35K for the max upside this year. We went above that. I was wrong about that view. You just I just accept it and move on. I don't try to get in the business of predicting when is going to be the high. But I just thought it was fascinating that it moved up the exact same amount. What's more interesting to me is that this level that it's at here is actually where it was in October of 2021 when you account for, you know, for inflation. So just an interesting thing to look at. Maybe I'll do a longer video on that at some point. But in this video, I do mainly want to just focus on Bitcoin USD. You know, what are the trends? What are the structure, or what is the structure of these higher lows? The time frame between them. If we do get a pullback, where are you looking to go? History shows us that, you know, either the breakout point somewhere over there, it could be the bull market support band, and then every prior cycle, except for maybe 2011. You know, I mean, 2011 when we broke out above the 100-week SMA, we never really went back and back tested it. But the cycle, you know, the last cycle, you can see that we did in February 2016, and then over here we tested it in early 2020, late 2019 as well, and then also came back down to it in March of 2020, but then failed to hold it. So, you know, 6 months from now, we could be looking back at this and see some form of retest of the 100-week moving average, but, you know, it could be at a much different price than it is today, right? And the 100-week SMA is slowly starting to curl back up. It hasn't really started that yet, but you can see that it won't take too much longer, maybe a few more months before it's starting to trend back up, assuming that Bitcoin USD can stay elevated. So I think we'll go ahead and wrap it up there. That more or less, you know, covers what I wanted to cover in the video. Just looking at, it's just speculating dubiously, of course, on where we are in the cycle, trying to hold this structure. You know, do we get a scare where we put in a macro high or low or a double bottom? It's possible, right? It's probably silly to assume it has to happen, but it is possible that something like that could happen. And if it does, it's probably worthwhile to be prepared for that outcome. But going into it, assuming it has to happen, can be a hard way to navigate the market, because then you could end up YOLOing at the top, only to see it finally go back down to where you were hoping. So just remember, it's difficult to time the market. DCA for Bitcoin has historically been the best strategy in most cases. You know, I mean, if you start DCAing even at the highs, as long as you sort of stick with it, you know, it does tend to pan out over the long haul. With Bitcoin, for altcoins, it's really hit or miss. Some altcoins just fade to zero. Some eventually go back up and put in new highs, but it's a lot more hit or miss than it is for Bitcoin. So what I will look for is you know, a potential back test at some point of some of these levels in the short term. If Bitcoin wants to trend higher, then I suspect that the next areas are around 42K to look at. That would be the 0.5, which is where Bitcoin topped out in 2019 on the weekly time frame. And when you account for inflation, it was actually at the current valuation where it topped out. So a lot of different ways you could interpret the price action. Make sure you guys have a plan, stick to it. Thank you guys for tuning in. Again, make sure you check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. You can use code 2023 to get another 10% off your first month. You just put it in at checkout, and I will see you guys next time. Bye.